For over a millennium, a single metropolis stood as the indestructible hinge between East and West, dictating the flow of global wealth and preserving the ancient light of classical antiquity. Protected by the legendary Theodosian walls, this fortress city was the undisputed master of its domain, an eternal Roman bastion that had shattered countless invading armies. But across the Bosporus, a rising power was dragging unprecedented engines of destruction toward those very gates. In a matter of weeks, the ancient world would violently collapse, and a terrifyingly modern era would rise from the rubble. By the mid-15th century, the once sprawling Byzantine Empire was a ghost of its former glory. Reduced to little more than the city of Constantinople and a few scattered territories, the Second Rome was entirely surrounded by the expanding territories of the Ottoman Empire. Yet, despite its diminished borders, the city remained the ultimate strategic prize. It controlled the vital maritime choke point between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea, serving as the primary conduit for the lucrative Silk Road trade that fed European markets. The man determined to claim this prize was Sultan Mehmet II, a young and fiercely ambitious leader who understood that capturing the city was both a strategic necessity and a divine mandate. Ascending to the throne at just 19, he recognized that the continued existence of a Christian enclave in the heart of his empire was an unacceptable vulnerability. Mehmet possessed a ruthless intellect and a deep appreciation for the emerging science of artillery, recognizing that traditional siege warfare was about to become fundamentally obsolete. To breach defenses that had stood unconquered for 1,000 years, the Sultan required a weapon of apocalyptic proportions. He commissioned a Hungarian engineer named Orban to cast a massive bronze cannon, a terrifying piece of ordnance capable of firing stone balls weighing over 1,000 pounds. This monstrous weapon required hundreds of oxen to transport and could only be fired a few times a day, but its sheer kinetic energy was enough to shatter the very concept of static fortification. In the spring of 1453, the Ottoman war machine encircled the city, dragging their massive artillery into firing positions opposite the most vulnerable sections of the ancient walls. The bombardment was relentless and psychologically devastating, shaking the earth and crumbling masonry that had withstood centuries of earlier assaults. Defenders worked frantically through the night to repair the breaches with earth and timber, engaging in a desperate contest of attrition against a seemingly inexhaustible enemy. Inside the besieged capital, Emperor Constantine XI led a doomed but heroic defense, commanding a severely outnumbered garrison of Greeks, Venetians, and Genoese mercenaries. They fought not just for their lives, but for the survival of an unbroken Roman lineage, stretching back to Augustus. The emperor famously refused offers of surrender, choosing instead to share the fate of his capital, embodying the tragic resolve of a dying civilization staring into the abyss of its own extinction. When a massive iron chain, suspended across the Golden Horn, prevented the Ottoman fleet from attacking the city's weaker sea walls, Mehmet executed a maneuver of staggering audacity. Under the cover of darkness, he ordered his engineers to construct a greased wooden runway over the hills of Galata, using teams of oxen and hundreds of men. The Ottomans physically hauled their warships out of the water, over the land, and dropped them directly into the inner harbor, completely outflanking the Byzantine defenses. The final assault commenced in the early hours of May 29, 1453, with waves of Ottoman infantry hurling themselves at the exhausted defenders. After hours of brutal, close-quarters combat, a small contingent of Ottoman troops discovered an unlocked postern gate, while simultaneously the massive cannons finally tore a decisive gap in the main defensive line. The Janissaries, Mehmet's elite shock troops, poured through the breach, overwhelming the defenders and sealing the fate of the city in a torrent of blood and steel. The silence that eventually fell over the ruined streets marked the definitive end of the Roman Empire in the East. As Mehmet rode through the conquered city, Transforming the magnificent Hagia Sophia into a mosque, he fundamentally rewrote the geopolitical map of Eurasia. The impregnable fortress had fallen, and with it the long-standing buffer that had shielded Western Europe from the expanding power of the Islamic world was completely obliterated. Yet the shockwaves of this conquest were not purely military. They triggered a profound intellectual exodus that would alter the trajectory of human thought. As the Ottoman grip tightened in the years leading up to and immediately following the siege, scores of Byzantine scholars, theologians, and linguists fled westward to Italy. They carried with them priceless manuscripts of ancient Greek philosophy, science, and literature, texts that had been largely lost or forgotten in Western Europe during the Middle Ages. The arrival of these scholars in city-states like Florence and Venice provided a massive injection of classical knowledge, acting as a vital catalyst for the Renaissance. The translation of works by Plato, Homer, and Ptolemy fueled a radical shift in European intellectual life, moving society away from medieval scholasticism and toward humanism. The death of the ancient empire paradoxically birthed a golden age of art and science, proving that cultural shifts often emerge from the ashes of geopolitical catastrophe. While the intellectual landscape of Europe was blooming, its economic foundation was facing an existential crisis. The Ottoman capture of the city gave them absolute control over the Bosporus Strait, allowing them to monopolize the crucial trade routes connecting Europe to the riches of the East. The flow of spices, silks, and precious metals was suddenly subjected to heavy taxation, embargoes, and the political whims of a hostile superpower strangling the economies of Venice and Genoa. This economic stranglehold forced European monarchs to confront a terrifying reality. They were cut off from the global economy. To survive, they had to bypass the Ottoman monopoly entirely, sparking a desperate search for alternative maritime routes to India and China. The fall of the city transformed the Atlantic Ocean from a terrifying, unnavigable void into the only viable frontier for future European prosperity and survival. The resulting maritime scramble directly triggered the age of exploration, an era of unprecedented global expansion and discovery. Navigators like Vasco da Gama and Christopher Columbus, funded by monarchs desperate for new wealth, pushed their caravels into uncharted waters. Columbus's fateful voyage in 1492 was fundamentally a reaction to the events of 1453, demonstrating how a localized siege in the eastern Mediterranean inadvertently led to the European discovery of the Americas. One must wonder how the world map would look today if those ancient walls had miraculously held back the Ottoman tide, if the Byzantine Empire had somehow survived, maintaining the open flow of Eastern trade to European merchants. The intense economic pressure that drove the Iberian nations into the Atlantic would never have materialized. The immense risks taken by explorers to cross the ocean were born of absolute necessity. Without that desperation, the globalized world as we know it might have been delayed by centuries. Instead, the reality of Ottoman dominance forced a permanent realignment of global power structures. The newly established Ottoman Empire expanded rapidly, projecting naval power across the Mediterranean and pushing deep into the Balkans and Central Europe. For the next several centuries, European diplomacy and military strategy would be defined by the urgent need to contain this formidable Eastern superpower, shaping alliances and sparking conflicts that would tear the continent apart. The siege also served as a stark, undeniable proof of concept for the supremacy of gunpowder artillery. The shattering of the Theodosian walls signaled to military engineers across the globe that tall, thin masonry defenses were now little more than death traps. This necessitated a massive shift in military architecture, leading to the development of the Star Fort, characterized by low, thick earthen walls designed to absorb cannon fire and provide overlapping fields of defensive artillery. Analyzing this pivotal moment reveals the astonishing interconnectedness of military innovation and global economics. The deployment of a single massive cannon not only ended a thousand-year-old empire, but permanently altered the flow of global capital. It is a stark reminder that strategic choke points, whether physical straits or technological advantages, dictate the fortunes of nations and the direction of human progress. The echoes of that ancient conflict still resonated long after the dust settled over the rubble of the imperial capital. The psychological trauma inflicted upon Christian Europe by the loss of their eastern bulwark fueled centuries of religious and political anxiety. Yet it also instilled a relentless drive for innovation, pushing European powers to develop new naval technologies, financial instruments, and military doctrines to compete in a rapidly expanding world. By closing the traditional door to the east, Mehmet inadvertently forced open a window to the west, shifting the center of global gravity away from the Mediterranean and toward the Atlantic. The nations that adapted to this new reality, investing in deep water navigation and colonial expansion, became the architects of the modern era. The nations that clung to the old Mediterranean trade networks slowly withered, outpaced by a world that had expanded far beyond their traditional horizons. The fall of Constantinople stands as the ultimate testament to the concept of eras shifting under the weight of conflict. It was not merely a transfer of territory, but a violent severing of the medieval world from the modern one. The destruction of the old order was the necessary prerequisite for the intellectual awakening of the Renaissance and the global. Ultimately, the events of 1453 serve as a profound lesson in the fragility of empires and the unstoppable momentum of technological and strategic evolution. The legacy of that single, catastrophic siege is woven into the very fabric of our modern world, from the classical texts that line our libraries to the global maritime trade routes that sustain our economy. The walls of the ancient city may have crumbled into dust, but the geopolitical and cultural shifts they unleashed continue to shape the destiny of human civilization.